Hello there, and welcome to What's the Point? A question we should all be asking ourselves, and the podcast by brand architect Bill Ellis that will help you discover, clarify, and live your purpose.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this episode of What's the Point, a podcast committed to helping you discover, clarify, and live your purpose. Today's guest is a gentleman that is a true humanitarian. He has helped, and we'll get into this in great detail, he has helped probably tens of thousands of people to live a better life than they otherwise would have. My guest today is Steve Sosebee, and he is the president and founder of the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Hello, Steve. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure, and having learned of you several years ago and having made you one of my then Friday Fearless Brands blog subjects, there's so much to not only to learn about you, but importantly to learn from you. And that's what I want to focus on today. So to begin with, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, or the PCRF, we'll go to the acronym. You founded that some 30 years ago, correct?
Yeah. The origins came from me working in the West Bank as a freelance writer during the first Palestinian uprising called Intifada. And my purpose there, I had gone as a college student on a human rights delegation with about 8 other students in December of 1988, which was the first year of the first Palestinian uprising. And it was I had never really been out of the country. I'd been out of the country once before, but never under those circumstances or in that kind of setting. And having gone for 3 weeks during Christmas break of my junior year in college, and being able to see firsthand and live with Palestinian families and see firsthand the struggle that they were undergoing for freedom and independence, and at the same time, the brutality of trying to repress that struggle through the use of violence and force by the military there was an eye-opening experience for me. I had never, we all kind of live sheltered lives for the most part in the United States. So seeing that firsthand and being born in a free country and then seeing people who don't have the most basic freedom of going where they want, saying what they want, doing what they want, like we have in the U.S., really changed my life in a very significant way. And I wanted to, and most importantly, I think what I experienced there firsthand was the kindness and generosity of the Palestinian people. They were very open. They were very hospitable. And everywhere I went, people welcomed me with such kindness, genuine kindness. And their only request ever was just to share their story with the American people, because they knew that the American people are decent and fair. And if they were truly enlightened and aware of what was happening in the West Bank and Gaza, what was happening under military occupation, what was happening in Palestine, the Americans wouldn't tolerate it. They wouldn't stand for it. And I believe that as well. The problem was Americans are not informed, and they don't have good information or good insight of what the reality is on the ground in the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. And that's all they ever asked of me. And I felt, well, that's the minimum. Like, if your country is supporting an injustice, the very basic minimum is that we should be aware of that. Mm-hmm. So I went back, finished university, went back to work as a writer in the West Bank because I wanted to share those stories of just everyday people that I met. I wasn't looking to try to change things politically. I don't think that that's possible for a college student coming out of Kent State University. But I did want to kind of, hopefully, a little bit like what you're doing, Bill, if you can change one person's mind, if you can change a few people's mind, if you can enlighten people to what the truth is and what the reality is, things can change. And that's the first step. So that's what I wanted to do as a writer. And during the course of writing for the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs and a few other newspapers in the U.S., I met a boy and girl, a young brother and sister from the West Bank town of Hebron in the southern West Bank, who had been badly injured in a bombing of their home. The boy was a triple amputee. His sister had 2 compound fractures. And they were in bad need of medical care they couldn't get in Palestine. So I always wanted to help people. I always felt that that's, if you see something and you know that it needs to be fixed, then it's your responsibility then to work on that, in particular when it comes to children who are injured. So I took their photos and went back to Ohio where I was working. At that time, I was constantly trying to survive. I had just finished university. So I was working as a freelance writer, not able to sustain myself professionally at that time. But I was able to, I was work seasonally as a landscaper in Ohio. And then, so I went back to work as a landscaper to start the summer and to save money and go back to work in Palestine as a writer. And I took the photographs of these children and found a doctor in Ohio. To make a long story short, was able to bring these kids over in May of 1990 for free medical care. And they were the first injured Palestinian children to come to the U.S. for treatment. I was 23 or 24 years old. I'd never had any idea how to get two kids who I didn't speak the same language with. Yeah. I myself, was a kid, and looking back at it, I was just a kid myself. But I brought them over, and I found, this was part of my duty of helping the people there, but also helping to educate and enlighten Americans. Because when these kids came to Northeast Ohio for treatment, they were well received in the media. It was a humanitarian story. They were very charismatic children, if that's a proper term. Their beautiful smiles, their beautiful energy, and the media covered them. They were on the front page of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is one of the largest newspapers in the country. They were on the front page of the Akron Beacon Journal, another large newspaper. Mm-hmm. They were on the television news locally in Northeast Ohio, and people started to see for the first time the other side of the issue, the human side, that Palestinian children, and by the way, at that time, hundreds of Palestinian children had been injured and killed in the uprising.
Let me interrupt you there, Steve.
Sure.
I'm sorry, but there's so much that you've already delivered.
Okay.
And I don't want to pass it by or to leave it dangling.
Sure.
So first of all, let me do some clarification, because I appreciate your kind words, and you had said that my mission of changing a mind, I'm not necessarily focused on changing anyone's mind. I'm very focused on helping to present information otherwise not known, and to use the word that you've used a couple of times, hopefully enlighten some people to the fact that there are always two sides of the story, and frankly, sometimes three sides to the story. Because I think there is a great deal of misunderstanding and misrepresentation here in the States. And I know that from personal experience, not quite as dramatic as yours. So I just wanted to clarify that. But also, so for the time being, we're going to leave those two charismatic young children in the hospital in Ohio. We'll come back to them, but I want to go back years before that in Ohio and touch base a little bit, Steve, on you and your upbringing and some of the things that help to shape the person that you are and your beliefs and your insights. Because as you said, you grew up in Northeast Ohio, and you're probably happy that the Cleveland Browns are showing some life and having some interesting games anyway.
Yeah. You must not have watched the game yesterday. I don't know if that's showing life, but go ahead. Go on.
Well, at least they're not. Anyway, we'll move on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you grew up there. Your mother was a teacher?
My father was a teacher. My mother was a nurse. Yeah.
And so talk to me a little bit about the environment there. You were one of three children, you and two sisters, three sisters?
Four sisters.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks, Bill. So, yeah, the biggest influence on my life have been my parents. And obviously, it should always be that. But in my case, it's definitely true. And what I mean by that is when it comes to social activism, for example, or how I got focused on doing something in my life that was to get involved in an issue that required solidarity with an oppressed people. My parents were both very active on social justice issues. In the 60s, my father and mother both were very much involved in civil rights issues and women's rights issues. And my father in particular was working we lived in a segregated town in northern Ohio, Northeast Ohio, which you'd think, the North doesn't have segregation. But as we know, in the United States, denying equal access to housing for African Americans was part of a government policy. It's well documented. And that government policy was nationwide. It wasn't just in the South where we know segregation and Jim Crow was institutionalized, but in the North as well. So we lived in a segregated town and called Cuyahoga Falls, and which is near where we moved to. And in 1968, my father was pushing very hard for desegregating our town because African Americans were not able to purchase property in the town we lived in. And which is an interesting story because my father comes from the Jim Crow South. He was born in his first 6 years were in North Carolina as a dirt poor white man, and he grew up in a very racist environment and moved north. His family immigrated north, seeking better employment opportunities in the rubber factories of Akron. But they brought with them that Southern, and I hate to generalize because not everybody in the South has these. Back then, it was more common. Views of race. And but my father broke away from that and was, for some reason, I've talked about this with him quite a bit, how he escaped that racist mindset of a Southern white poor person and became very active in desegregating our town, why that became his issue, why he dedicated his town. He had 5 children. He was a young high school teacher, and yet he was taking a lot of his free time and going out trying to push for desegregation. Well, in 1968, our house was shot at for my father being active. So my origin, and we moved to Kent, which is 2 towns away from Cuyahoga Falls. It's a college town. It's more liberal. We all know what happened at Kent State on May 4th, 1970, when 4 students were killed by the Ohio National Guard protesting the invasion of Cambodia. We moved to a more liberal environment. My father obviously wanted to live in an environment where his kids had more diversity in the community. It's not as much as we would like, but it's much more than Cuyahoga Falls. A more enlightened population, people who are more exposed to world ideas and kind of liberal democratic viewpoints. And that's where I grew up. In Kent, following the shootings in Kent, Ohio. So I grew up in a college town where a lot of my fellow students in high school were children of college professors, and also in an environment that was more open to what activism and social responsibility meant. So I went to Kent State. Despite being brought up with very enlightened parents, I was also brought up in a very strong work ethic, meaning I had to pay my way through college. I had to work my way through college. Nobody paid for it. I didn't have scholarships. I didn't have financial aid. And that embedded in me also a very strong working class identity, and one in which I respect very much and consider myself still part of. And with that came a lot of respect for people who I can relate to from all different backgrounds and all different classes. And therefore, being kind of in solidarity with people who are struggling to support their families, people who have to struggle for equality, for basic rights that, at the end of the day, I'm still a white male American. That's the highest privileged class in the history of mankind on a general scale. And I always believed, and I was raised to believe, that comes with a responsibility, that you have this privilege that you didn't earn, that you then have to utilize to support our brothers and sisters from different races, different ethnicities, different political circumstances, different economic conditions, to achieve a sense of equality and fairness in the world.
Yeah.
And for
your work ethic, sorry to interrupt.
That's right.
I just still am striving to make sure that we get a true sense of the human and the humanitarianism of you, Steve Sosebee. So when you worked your way, so at least a couple of your sisters, was it in Kent or still in Cuyahoga Falls, where they had to be escorted to and from school because of some of the, we'll say, dissatisfaction with your father in particular's efforts? Yeah,
following the shooting, the Cuyahoga Falls police had to escort my sisters. They were a little bit older than me, but they were going to elementary school, had to escort them to school. And you can imagine, as parents, for my father and mother, and at that time in 1968, I think all of the kids were under the age of 10. We had 5 children under the age of 10. Wow. My parents did. And somebody shooting a shotgun at your front door, what kind of fear and what kind of courage that takes to stick to your convictions And both of my parents stuck to their convictions. They weren't trying to have our home bombed or our family harmed, but they knew that this was something greater than any of us individually. And that's where I got that belief and responsibility of serving a cause and a issue greater than myself and greater than any one individual.
Yeah. And again, so that situation, Steve, was one that I would say the majority of children in this country, in particular, the majority of middle class or upper class children, would never have experienced that type of situation as a child. So you seeing your home shot at, you seeing your sisters needing to have a police escort to and from school, must have had a significant impact on how you did see things and how you were able to appreciate that type of impact on your lives and your freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, I was only 2.5, 3 years old at the time, but obviously, even at that age, that's part of your, let's just say, socialization and politicization as a human being. So, sorry, couldn't get that word out, but I think you know what I mean. It formed my identity, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. And at that young age, you don't understand the world. A lot of I still don't understand the world today. But I mean, at that time, when you're that young, humans harming humans over ideas, humans committing acts of violence towards other humans to children doesn't make sense. Why? Yeah. What's the reason for? There's no justification for it. It's beyond the concept of what an innocent mind can comprehend. So probably at that time, I couldn't understand why somebody would try to hurt my family. And if my parents, which they probably did, sat me down and tried to explain it, well, we want to make our community open to everybody. And I would ask, well, why isn't it open? And they would say, because they have a different pigmentation of their skin. And I would say, but that doesn't make sense. They're still people, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, they're still people. So why does the color of skin have to do with whether they are good people or bad people, or why we want them as neighbors? And then it's children are, if you break it down like that, that's like the foundation of the whole issue. That's what it really comes down to. And we adults have, just destroyed the basic logic and reasoning behind what these issues really mean, the basic core humanity, mm-hmm. which is that we're all just on this planet as human beings, and we have to treat each other with love and kindness, and we have to support each other and stand with those who are struggling just to live in this world as brothers and sisters, as neighbors, without being oppressed, without being subjugated, without having to endure the hardships because of the pigmentation of their skin, their sexual orientation, their religion, or anything else.
Yeah, whatever their heritage might be. And, a lot of that, unfortunately, is taught. We, as humans, I don't believe, are born with any proclivity to have a certain bias towards any one race, gender, creed. So that comes back to why I do this and why you do what you do, and that is an effort to bring some enlightenment to help people see a more full picture and perhaps have them see things in a little bit of a different light, or in dramatically a different light. So thanks for sharing that. And just a quick question: Are your folks still with us? Are they still alive? Or
my father is. My mom passed away a week before COVID started, but they both lived full lives. And while my father, as a man of high principles, both my parents were. My mother was truly my father's a loving spirit as well. But what I got from my mom was, as a lot of people get from their mothers, is that compassionate, loving engagement or relationship. And I just remember, just to honor her memory a little bit, how, as a child, how comforting the hugs of my mother were to me, and how that made me feel. So I can't define it. I can't articulate it other than saying it just brought such peace to my spirit and to, as a child, security of love. And that's what my mom taught me. she was an amazing woman. She wasn't an intellectual like my father, but she was, in some senses, even more highly evolved than we were, because love is the highest form of human evolution, far more beyond the intellectual aspect of who we are. And she had that. And she lived her entire life up until the end, being able to express that love and give that love to everybody around her. And she was truly a remarkable spirit, and I learned so much from her.
Well, what a magnificent tribute to your mother, and the people and the lives that she's touched, no doubt, are large and varied in number. So that's terrific. But what I was going to get to is just, I have to think that both your parents have been very proud of what you have dedicated your life to doing, given what they went through when you were 2, 3, 8, 10, 12. So you went to Kent State. What you said you worked your way through with, and earlier you mentioned you came back to school to do landscaping. Is that what you were doing to get through school?
It was indeed. I was a landscaper all through college, and I would study full-time and work full-time, and I loved it. I love working outdoors. I love being with a group of guys or a team and building something. And you would go into someone's home and tear up their bushes and plant new ones and make it look more beautiful and organize their landscape. And it was really hard work. And I learned a lot from my bosses, because they never let us take lunch breaks, because they didn't. They were like, well, you can take a break if you want, but I'm going to keep working. I'm like, but you're the boss. So they set an example of leadership, and leaders don't ask people to do what they're not willing to do. And they set the standard by doing themselves. And that's where I learned leadership from work doing landscaping. And my bosses, in particular, Gary Sheptock, every day he was the hardest worker. And he wasn't getting paid that much more. It was just a small business. But he set the standard for what, and we followed him. And I learned, okay, if you want to be a leader, you have to lead by example. And I've always carried that in all of my leadership actions and responsibilities.
Yeah, that makes me think of the book, Simon Sinek's book, Leaders Eat Last. Sorry. And in your case, it was Leaders Don't Eat.
We would try to grab a snack somewhere, because it was actually pretty hard physical labor. When you're doing railroad ties and digging up huge bushes and planting trees, there's, even if you're 21, 22 years old, 19 years old, your body still needs fuel. So we would grab a bite, between wheelbarrowing, dirt. But, we never just sat down and took a break. And I learned a lot from that kind of leadership. And I think there's a lot to be said about being that kind of leader, and not just talking about leadership, but actually demonstrating leadership.
That's important. So now you've worked all day, your body's sore, you finally get a chance to eat, and you get to go to class and study. And you studied, I think, international relations?
I did. It was political science with a language, which in hindsight was a big mistake, but I managed to get through it. I studied Russian, and had the most fascinating Russian teacher, who actually was a Russian soldier in World War II fighting in Ukraine. So he had some very interesting stories. And at that time, that was the Cold War. So I figured, well, study Russian and see. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I knew I was interested in the world, the world around us. I was interested in politics, but I never really could put my finger on what I actually wanted to do and what I could do. I wasn't gifted as a student. I was smart and I liked to read, but I wasn't gifted. Financially, I didn't have opportunities to go to some schools that, give you opportunities in those fields. So I really was kind of not clear as to what my path was, but I knew what I liked to do and what I liked to study.
Yeah, that kind of starts to get to the essence of this podcast, Steve, where that started to shape the foundation of your purpose, even though you didn't know what your purpose was. You started to understand the platform and the parameters and the direction that you felt your life would want to go, even though you didn't have clarity on it. And that's part of the message I want to get across to all of the listeners, is that we don't just turn a light on and our purpose is there. sometimes finding our true purpose can take years or decades. So that I wanted to make that point because that sets you on a path. And then you went to Palestine with that humanitarian visit. Then you came back to Kent State.
Yeah.
And at that point, you had another example of, shall we say, a lack of open-mindedness when you were having some interplay with one of your professors.
I hadn't heard it described like that, but yes, that's certainly one way to describe it. Well, I came back after finishing 3-week tour of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, in December of 1988, which again is the end of the first year of the first Palestinian uprising, which was an incredible time. It was an incredible time of brutality and hardship for the Palestinians, but inspiring time where the people were collectively on a grassroots level coming together as one entity: Christian, Muslim, rich, poor, townsfolk, peasants, refugees, people from all classes and backgrounds came together, united, and resisted and sacrificed together from all classes. So it was very inspiring and something that you very rarely get to see in the world, even today.
So let me just jump in here again. I'm sorry to keep cutting you off,
no
but
problem.
You bring such richness, and I just want to make sure that it's not missed. So there is some enlightenment that I think most of us, in particular on the American side of the world, can learn. You just said that Palestinians came together, and you mentioned Muslim, you mentioned Christian, you mentioned old, you mentioned young, you mentioned a bunch of diversity. Define as best you can succinctly when the presentation that we have for most part in America is Palestinians are terrorists with guns and bombs and anger. And I know that's not your experience, and frankly, it's not mine either. But there is that segment where that's true, but it doesn't define the entire segment by any stretch. So share some of your sights on clarifying the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, the Palestinian people themselves are the indigenous population of the Holy Land, the indigenous population of Palestine, and what is the state of Israel today. It was once Mandate Palestine and was inhabited and is inhabited by an Arab population, which includes a Jewish minority at the time. Jews can be Arabs, Christians can be Arabs, Muslims can be Arabs. It's a ethnicity defined by language, not by race or religion. Mm-hmm. They are a very rich culture and a rich history. Obviously, the Holy Land has been a troubled land due to the fact that it's important to the three main monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which has brought a lot of rich textures and beauty and culture to the land, but also a lot of strife and conflict. Mm-hmm. And in Palestine itself, the population has, since 1917, when the British gave Palestine, I guess I should use air quotes, it wasn't theirs to gave Palestine to the Zionist movement in Europe, mainly, to go and settle there and to create a Jewish national home, as they called it, without consulting or taking into consideration the interests or the desires of the Palestinian Arab population at that time. The conflict began. And since then, the Palestinians have continued to see their land taken, their rights denied, and their national identity suppressed. And their effort to liberate themselves and to free themselves, as we did in this country with the same culprit at the time, Britain, up in many national liberation struggles all over the world, have included a variety of different civil and non-civil efforts, collective strikes, petitions to the United Nations, to the League of Nations, to the international community, all various forms, and that has also included acts of terrorism, which, of course, I don't agree with. I'm not somebody who ever agrees with violence, but it doesn't define who they are, nor does it should define their resistance. And the first intifada that I saw firsthand was not a terrorist endeavor of the Palestinians. They were resisting occupation in a variety of ways, demonstrations, strikes. They would, every day, all the shop owners closed their stores in protest at noon. So if you owned a small little shop in the West Bank and you were living hand to mouth, basically, as many people do there, and you willingly close your store to show the world and to show your occupier that this status quo is no longer tenable, that's a nonviolent, legitimate form of resistance. Mm-hmm. It meant it resolved nothing. The occupation continued, the hardships continued, and the Palestinian resistance often took a more extreme route. When the peaceful methods were exhausted or failed, they turned to extremism in some cases, not all. And that was often portrayed in our Western media for a couple of reasons. It's, when somebody blows up a pizza shop, that's news. When a community closes their shops at noon, that's not news if they do it every day for 6 months. So that's one reason. The other reason was it discredits the legitimate cause behind the Palestinians and a point, which is they want an end to the occupation. They want their national rights. They want their freedom. And our government has almost always prevented or been on the wrong side of this issue. We want to support the continuation of the Israeli occupation, the continuation of building settlements, although our lip service often goes in contrary to that. That's not our actions. We pay for it. Our tax money pays for that. So it's much easier to give billions of dollars of military aid every year to an occupying army if you try to delegitimize the national or the political cause of the people that they are occupying. Mm-hmm. So, but that doesn't change the fact that the Palestinians themselves, like every people on the planet, have a right to equality, to liberation, to freedom, and to live in peace and security like the state of Israel, like everybody else. So that's not what I saw when I went there. I didn't see, and I was just funny because I was just reading something I wrote in November 9 years ago today. I was in Gaza during a war. It was one of the many wars on Gaza. And I was on the ground there. And I just wrote that I had just visited a funeral of a 2-year-old Palestinian boy whose home was hit by a drone bomb and his entire family was killed. And I stood outside the funeral with a bunch of young men who I didn't know in Gaza, clearly an American, clearly a foreigner, and not a single person. And we just watched this body, this mangled body of a 2-year-old being passed down, being carried down the street to be buried. And not a single person pointed an accusing finger at me. Not a single person shook their fist in my face or asked me, why is my government paying for those bombs, or accused me of murder. And I can't say I would treat those people the same way if that was a 2-year-old neighbor of mine and somebody from the country who paid for that bomb showed up and watched that child's burial and funeral take place. So I've always been treated with kindness, respect, and dignity by the Palestinian people. And I've always felt a certain element of respect for their courage and for their ability to separate individuals from government policies, which is not something we have in this country the ability to do. The dysfunctional politics in this country today, which is eroding our democracy, is not something you see in countries like Palestine. They have problems there, significant problems, but the people never attack each other. It never attacked me or pointed an accusatory finger at me for the government policies that of the United States government, which I'm obviously a citizen of.
Yeah, and proud to be, I know.
I am.
So speaking of being attacked or confronted, if you will, back to Kent State, where you were in that international relations course, or maybe it was the history of the Middle East course, whichever. You convinced your professor to let you present the not an opposing view, but a different view, and certainly since it was you boots on the ground, if you will, a realistic view. And he finally relented. What happened?
Well, I had just come back from my 3-week tour and started a class called History of the Middle East with Saul Friedman as my professor at Kent State. And I just remember I had read a lot I'm very well versed on the history and the politics of the Middle East. So I'd come back, and I just remember every day in class, his viewpoints were always very kind of one-sided and skewed. They weren't what you would expect in a college setting, where you try to give all viewpoints and have a very kind of open presentation, not kind of like a biased one. And I always felt his points were biased, and I always would raise my hand and counter it every single day, because look, those American students didn't know. Like, they had no idea. They didn't read books. They didn't know who Edward Said was. They didn't know Noam Chomsky. They didn't know anybody when it came to the Middle East. So they were basically just ingesting what this professor was saying and believing it was the case. And I'm like, but what about this? What about that? So finally he got frustrated with me, and I said, look, I just was 3 weeks in the West Bank and Gaza. I saw things even you've never seen, and I'd like to share it. I'd like to do a presentation with the class. They deserve that. I'm a fellow student. It's a great opportunity for you, Professor Friedman. So he finally relented and said, look, if you'll shut up and let me teach my class, I'll let you do your presentation. And I said, fine. So back then you didn't have PowerPoint computers and, digital presentations. I, organized all my slides and put them in one of those round kind of slide projectors.
Carousel.
Thank you, carousel. It was ready, the night before. I prepared my presentation for my fellow students in the History of Middle East class about what I had just seen in the West Bank, and was coming up the stairs to the class, and the nephew of Saul Friedman was waiting for me. He was in the class himself, and didn't want me to present to the students in a different view than what his uncle was presenting. Unknowing, I had no idea. I didn't even know he was in the class. Took my carousel and smashed it on the ground, slammed it down. And all the slides went everywhere. And it was kind of my first real experience of how deeply passionate, or I guess that's the right word, tense, people's attachment are to this issue. Mm-hmm. In a college setting where the free exchange of opposing views of all kinds should be tolerated and even encouraged, the nephew of the professor of the class sought it a legitimate response to smash and deny me, through the use of violence and force, the right to share the truth of what I'd seen firsthand with my fellow students. And that showed me, and I remember thinking to myself, well, I have two choices here. I can go, and I was politically active at that time on other issues like South Africa, like Central America. Those were big issues with U.S. foreign policy at the time. I can just go back on those kind of safe issues. Nobody's going to smash my carousel about ending apartheid in South Africa, or the U.S. support of the Contras overthrowing Nicaraguan government. No one cares enough to attack you violently about that. Or I can stand with my brothers and sisters in Palestine, who just opened their homes to me, opened their hearts to me, opened their world to me, and expected me to show just the smallest amount of courage in showing the world they live in and sharing that with my fellow American students and brothers and sisters. It just took a little courage for me, but I just seen what courage meant. I just saw young men my age in Palestine losing their limbs and losing their lives for freedom. And if I can't speak the truth, if I can't stand for justice, if I can't support their cause for freedom, then I don't have the right to call myself a true patriot and a true American. So I made a decision then. I was going to continue to speak out. I was going to continue to support them. And if people are going to use violence to kind of destroy my right to speak out, then I must be doing something right, because it's just words. And if you can't counter words with words, you counter words with violence, then you are, I believe the term is, a fascist.
Yes, that is what the term is. So now let's fast forward. Let's move back to those two charismatic young children in the hospital there in Northeast Ohio. That triggered something in you, and that started a movement.
Yeah, man, what I saw is that even just a guy who just finished college, who doesn't have any true skill set, can make a change and make a difference. These kids came without legs, came in need of medical care, and all it took for me was to organize their logistics and organize their medical treatment. And I was able to, first of all, get them the care they needed, which they couldn't get, change their lives, get them walking again, get them back to being, start the healing process. number one. Number two, it exposed what I wanted to do, our fellow Americans, to what was happening in Palestine, because we were paying for it. Like, at least know what you're getting for your money. And this is what we were getting. We were getting maimed children. It also organized the community in Northeast Ohio to be involved and to find a way for them to do something for their people, Palestinian community. We have a rich, large Palestinian community in Cleveland and in Akron. And at Kent State, a lot of graduate students from the Middle East who wanted to do something. They wanted to find a positive way to contribute to their people and to their struggle, and not through violence, and not through hatred, and not through hurting others, but through healing their children and their people. So when I brought these kids, I brought them without their parents, and I put them with host families. And throughout the community, people came forward and took care of these children as if they were their own. And that showed me organizing our communities to respond to the needs of the people there. All it took was a leader. All it took was somebody to get it done. And so that was a big, big result of that action, of these kids coming as well. And then finally, for me, I found a purpose and a meaning in my life, something deep and spiritual, which gave me a sense of living life for something greater than myself. And I think we all search for that as human beings. We all want that. We all need that, to find that purpose. It's hard. It's a lifelong struggle. And I was very fortunate to find that spiritual, I don't want to say awakening, because I was always had that feeling and recognition consciously, even that I wanted to do something like that, but feeling that effect internally that, wow, this is something that gives my life purpose, and I'm not lost. And so when these kids went back, sent them back home, and I don't want to jump ahead if you want to continue to talk about them, but I sent them back home, took them back home actually, and people heard about them, and they said, wow, these two kids went to America without legs, he's coming back with legs, he's walking, they speak English, they have money for a college education, changed their lives. I have a neighbor, I have a sister, I have a friend, I heard about this child who was burned or who was injured, who was shot, who has a heart defect. Let me see if this guy can help them. So they started coming to me with more children who needed treatment. And I said, well, I just helped these two kids. Let me see if I can help that child. Okay, I can. Let me see if I can get that child free treatment in Los Angeles. I can. So I said, this is a great way for me to contribute in a positive way and achieve all of those 4 goals that I mentioned to you a minute ago. Getting these kids treatment they can't get locally, which is filling a big gap in the health system there. More importantly, changing these children's lives. Secondly, educating and exposing to the American people what the reality is on the ground there, because our media wasn't doing it. Organizing our communities in the States to be involved in a positive way, and satisfying me as a human being to do something for my fellow human beings that was gave me a sense of purpose and meaning in my life.
Well, that has just beautifully encompassed, Steve, what I call the purpose principle, which is when we seek our purpose and eventually find it, knowing that it will continue to change and evolve and hopefully grow, just as we will as humans, it ignites our passion. And it's not, I don't believe that we start with passion and that leads us to a purpose. I think that we find our purpose, which ignites our passion, and then that's the fuel to continue what we're doing. And that helps us embrace persistence, which you certainly have shown. So during these efforts, you also received what I would call a gift of the universe and meeting someone incredibly special while you were there in Palestine. Are you comfortable sharing that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was a gift from God. Some things are meant to be. True love is often meant to be. And during the course of starting to find children who needed medical care and sending them to the States, I received a phone call. Back then we didn't have cell phones, so I'm not even sure. I forget how that used to work, but where I was staying, got a message from someone. I called her back, and she was a social worker in the West Bank for the YMCA. They had at that time a program of identifying injured children and getting them rehabilitation locally. And she heard about this American guy who was taking kids for treatment in the U.S. And had some children who needed help, and she wanted to meet with me just to kind of share her cases and see if we could help them. And I said, sure. So she came by with her sister, back then, Arab women didn't meet, even today, didn't meet with foreign American guys on their own. So she brought her sister, and it was love at first sight. I just remember that when I first saw her, I just had that attraction, that connection, in my heart towards her. And she said it was the same, but, what else is she going to say if I say that to her? And we began a courtship, an innocent courtship. She is a Palestinian Muslim woman, and me as an American guy raised Catholic, of just falling in love and starting to, that amazing feeling when you fall in love, and those first days and months and weeks and months of that, that sensation whenever you see that person and that feeling you get when you're around them. That's what we had, but we couldn't be open about it because of cultural reasons. And so, we used to just go and just find any opportunity we could be, just to be alone and get to know each other. Mm-hmm. And eventually, we decided it was meant to be, and we wanted to get married and have a life together. And we, in January of 1993, we got married in the West Bank. I was the first American non-Arab guy to marry a Palestinian woman in the West Bank that we ever heard of. And at that time in the Intifada, it was still the Intifada was going on. We couldn't really have a party, but we did have a wedding, and we had and she was an amazing woman. And the courage it took for her as a Palestinian Arab Muslim woman to marry me shows, first of all, how deep our love was, but also, it shows how strong true love is and how important it is in the lives of so many people. And also her courage, because it didn't take much courage for me. I found a beautiful woman who was everything I wanted as a partner, whether she was Palestinian or Muslim or Arab or whatever. That's fine. I found love. Yeah. But for her, she had so much more she had to deal with culturally and so on. But she was willing to. And neither of us ever, even 1 minute, ever regretted that decision.
That's a truly amazing story, one I can relate to in a slightly similar way. So at that point, you had started the PCRF in 91.
Yeah.
So you two met and married, or met and then ultimately married in 93.
Yeah.
And she became your partner in the PCRF as well as your life. Tell us more about her, because I know the listeners here are pretty astute, so they may have heard you use the phrase "she was."
Yeah.
Tell us that story, Steve.
Yeah, so her name was Huda al-Masri, and her father was a refugee from West Jerusalem. Her mother was a refugee from a Palestinian town in central Palestine, which is now Israel. So they grew up as refugees, and she was 3 years older than me. And she was a social worker and an educator. So she had she had an incredible work ethic as well. She would teach at night at the university. She would work during the day as a social worker. She knew all of the villages. She would go into these small communities, and very strong personality, very strong woman. So she had that background of being able to take care of the kids that we would send for treatment. So obviously, when you bring a child from Palestine to the U.S., it's not just a medical challenge that you're trying to overcome. You have to take care of that child's mental health aspects, the cultural, the going to a foreign country, often without parents, and putting them with host families. And some of these children had suffered traumatic experiences of gunshot or bombing injuries. So she would take care of all of that, dealing with host families, dealing with the children, dealing with their mental health issues, dealing with their social issues, the diet, the communication, the medical appointments, their families back home, asking about them, all of the communication that's involved. She was amazing. She was a gifted woman, gifted spirit in these type of things. And then my job, of course, was the logistics, arranging the treatment, the visas, the passports, the funding. And together we were a team. And when we started PCRF, having her come in and take on that responsibility is how we became a successful organization. If it was just me as this guy from Ohio trying to do all of these responsibilities, which I wasn't experienced or able or capable to do, it would have failed. So she deserves the respect and the recognition and the credit for what she accomplished. And we did that for 17 years. And during the course had two daughters, Dima and Jenna. And after she had our second daughter, we were jumping ahead a bit. The organization grew over those 17 years of her and I together, and became more and more successful. And, the internet started, and we were able to utilize that as a platform and as a tool to strengthen our reach and our abilities and our networking and our support. But we were in Dubai one day with 6 kids that were amputees. We were sending them to the UAE for prosthetics for free. And she had been sick for about a month, on and off. We thought it was a virus. She had been taking antibiotics and not feeling well. And we were in the hospital in Dubai with these 6 kids. They were getting testing and so on. And she just went and got a blood test while she was in the hospital to see what kind of virus it was, and came back. It was leukemia. And I had never heard of leukemia before, despite running a medical relief organization. Cancer wasn't one of the areas we worked in. And we were shocked. And the next day we flew back to Ohio, and she went directly by ambulance from the plane to the hospital, to University Hospital, and started treatment for leukemia. And my life's never been the same since. And we were very happy the day before. This was actually on Christmas Day of 2008. And by July 15th of 2009, she passed away in our home here in Ohio. And during those 7 months of her struggling to live with cancer, and the bone marrow transplants and the chemotherapy and all of the treatment that she went through, which, eroded her body, it never eroded her spirit. I remember during one of the Gaza wars in 2008, 2009, when she first entered the hospital and was undergoing this kind of aggressive chemotherapy, and her hair was starting to fall out, and she was getting mouth sores, and her body was starting to lose weight. She was every day still doing her job as a social worker and trying to help these injured children and get them treatment and take care of the kids we were helping, and putting others ahead of herself. And I saw that every day, and just learned so much from her as what true humanity and what courage looks like. When she passed away, I had 2 daughters. I had a 12-year-old and a 2-year-old when she passed away, and I became a single father for 7 years. And I was able to start an initiative to build a cancer hospital in her name in Bethlehem, because there was no cancer services for children at Palestine. So we started an initiative, and we opened in April of 2013 a cancer department in her name, the Huda al-Masr department, thanks to private donors. I mean, the great thing about PCRF is the connection we have with our volunteers and with our supporters and donors and chapters, who were just one big family, in the sense that people knew her and they loved her and they wanted to honor her like I did as her husband. And they thought building a department in her name and keeping her legacy as a true humanitarian alive by healing others was the perfect way to honor her legacy. So that's that story with my wife, Huda al-Masri, and I've been very blessed I became a man when I married her. She taught me how to be a true man, in the sense that, to carry myself with dignity and courage, and what my mom started with her hugs and teaching me how to love, Huda completed by her love and her guidance as a very evolved spirit and an evolved person. And I learned so much from her, and will always honor her and respect her as the beautiful spirit that she was.
Well, I appreciate very much you sharing that. I know that you've had years to get, I'll say, comfortable with it, but honestly, I don't think we ever get truly comfortable with a loss like that. So I admire you and appreciate you sharing that, Steve. It helped me, and I'm sure it'll help some other listeners to address grief that we all share. So we're running close on time. I know I told you that we'd be. I want to respect your time and also that of our listeners, but I do want to say at this point that anyone and everyone listening that has an interest in learning more about PCRF and or donating and or volunteering in any way, shape, or form, tell us the website.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's pcrf.net, and you can see all the information there. You can contact me through the website if you like, if you wish to contact me. And there's definitely links for donations. There's the projects we are initiating, the programs we support, and if you have any questions or concerns or issues you'd like to discuss, just reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to engage.
Well, that's incredible, and thank you for your openness. That will also be in the show notes, along with some other tasty tidbits, I hope. So as it stands now, 30 years on in the organization, and one thing that hasn't changed is the need for children to receive proper care. And I want to emphasize that to all of our listeners, because regardless of anyone's viewpoint, politically or otherwise, at the end of the day, if we are truly human, if we are truly humanitarian, we must be focused on helping children to have a better chance to live a more normal life. And what you've done, not only to directly do that, but to help educate others, both in the situation on the West Bank and between Palestine and Israel, is to, on a bigger platform, as far as I'm concerned, to just recognize, yes, we have to do that. We have to focus on making this world better for children who didn't ask for any of this, who haven't contributed to any of this, but who have suffered significant consequences. And that's just as admirable as anything that I can imagine. Steve Sosebee, founder of PCRF, Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Let me ask you this. After all you've done in your 30 years with the Palestine Children's Relief Fund and your entire life of understanding that there is oppression that can and should be addressed, when you look at it all and you look at your experience to date, how do you answer the question of what's the point?
What's the point of what?
That's how you get to define it, my friend.
Well, okay, that's a very broad question, and thank you, Bill, for asking that, because I think about that every day. And, I believe look, I don't want to get into too much spirituality here, because we all live in the material world, and
Steve, take it wherever you want to take it.
Thank you, Bill. No one knows the true purpose of life. Maybe when we die, it's like a match going out and that's it. The spark of life is extinguished. I don't believe that. I don't know why I don't believe that, other than I have an innate feeling that deep down we're here for a purpose, and that there is a purpose that our spirit, which is eternal, comes here into the material world to serve a purpose. And it's up to us how evolved we are spiritually, either through the course of coming here and having this material human experience, or how evolved we are before we came here, to represent what that spirituality means. I believe ultimately, and we all should agree to this because we feel it deep in our hearts, that love is the true purpose of life. That whether that's love between individuals, love between neighbors, love for this world we live in, it's all makes sense when you feel it. The things that don't make sense are the negativity, the materialism, the hatred, the fear that is part of the human condition. And that's the struggle we all have to overcome every single day, allowing those aspects of our humanity to guide us and to define who we are as humans. The challenge is to constantly remind ourselves the true purpose of who we are and what we're here for. And it's different from everybody. Mike Trout, the outfielder for the Angels, his true purpose probably is to be a great, amazing baseball player, but also to be a human being, a decent human being, and how he interacts with people. I don't know him. I'm just using him as an example of somebody who has a purpose in life and is gifted and how he uses that purpose. For me, I believe what's the point is that I came here with a purpose. And along the course of my life, I've been guided. I mentioned my mother and father. I mentioned my first wife, Huda Al-Masri, and I've since remarried to another amazing woman, Zina, who is also a very evolved soul and a very incredibly intelligent person who guides me and has made me a better man every single day. And I think within the course of our spiritual existence in this material world, we have these chances to learn from others, to gain from others, to be better people, to be more purposeful and have a bigger impact on humanity. So I'm always open to learning from others and taking the positivity of others that we interact with every single day and using that to be a better person and to fulfill my purpose. And my purpose is what I'm doing. It's to build this organization or a organization, or to use my time and energy and my limited abilities to serve a cause and a people that I truly believe deep in my heart deserve my effort and attention and time. And hopefully, if there is a time when we're judged, and I don't know if I believe that, but if it comes, I want that judgment to be whether my time here was used in the pursuit of using love as my guiding force in all of my life material experiences. And that's the point for me, is that I want to fulfill that life mission and to serve this cause by healing others and to show them love and compassion that is very limited in their lives due to their economic and political circumstances. And hopefully, as I always have, learn and be a better man because of the people that I'm serving and helping. I get so much more from the people that I'm giving than I ever can give to them. And hopefully at the end, as the Beatles said at the end of Abbey Road, the love you make is equal to the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I hope by the end for me that I will have taken as much love as I've given from everybody, or vice versa.
Mm. Well, that's very profound, very deep, very spiritual, very honest, very open. And Steve Sosebee, I appreciate your time. I appreciate what you do. I appreciate the humanitarian that you are. So again, everybody, the link to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund will be in the show notes. I appreciate everyone that's listened because they've just done what you have purported you wanted to do, which is to grow, present different insight. And to repeat what I said earlier, people can take what you've said and do with it as they will. But if they've listened, they at least have the opportunity to consider things in a different manner or have it reinforce what they already believe. So, Steve, thank you again so much, not just for your time today, but for your efforts over 3+ decades of doing what you can to make this a better world. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We can promise you'll gain value in every one. Rating and reviewing makes us more discoverable and helps others find out what's the point. And if you'd like to know more about Bill Ellis or contact him, please visit his website, www.brandingpillars.com. See you next time.